Now I would like to introduce to Graham. Graham Parkhurst is a colleague from the University of West England in Bristol. He possesses a degree in psychology from the University of Warwick, an MSc from the University of Oxford in biological anthropology, and he holds a PhD from the University of Oxford in transport and geography. He is also professor of sustainable mobility and director of the Center for Transport and Society at the University of West England, and he has more than 2 decades of experience researching and teaching transport and mobility. So he has a long story on these topics, and he's currently the module leader of the master's module on transport policy and finance and sustainable transport management and operations. Currently, he is working in several research projects, considering particularly the societal implications of autonomous, it means driverless, vehicles, and the extent and quality of the evidence necessary to justify sustainable urban transport plan measures, and the potential for a more collective and connected transport system that can reduce the environmental impacts, while at the same time it lets achieve socio-economic objectives. So Graham, thank you very much for joining us and for your support. It is our pleasure. Now you can start your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to MoBAE for inviting me to present today. As has been introduced, I'm very much a social scientist specializing on transport and mobility policy, particularly new technologies and sustainability. I think I'm going to be picking up on a number of the issues raised by Bruce, but in more detail, perhaps focusing on those issues, because my particular interest here is what the role is for public transport. Now, by public transport, I mean also collective transport, shared mobility, but with an emphasis on the number of the people who are in the vehicle at one time. So what we can refer to as the occupancy of the vehicle. And my key point really is that we need to, in looking at the different mobility niches, the different business models, we always need to have in the back of our mind that if we're going to achieve a necessary efficiency, then we have to consider what we mean by sharing. So I'll start by considering how we currently portray the future and what that looks like in our imagery, in our discussions, discourses. I'm then going to move on to looking at 6 key reasons. There could be others, but I've picked 6 reasons why I think this high occupancy is really important and we must emphasize it. Then I'm going to go on to consider the prospects for sharing vehicles, reflecting on some of the difficulties and the social limitations, social conditioning that means that isn't always the natural thing for people to do. And lastly, I will come to a little bit of a challenge to those developing new mobility solutions and options. How can we create vehicles that are more attractive to be shared by people who don't know each other? And I have one provocative idea, but maybe you will have others in the discussion. I'll also draw upon the research we've been undertaking at the Centre for Transport and Society. We're a specialised centre looking very much at how technology changes the relationship between society and transport. And I'll bring in our research particularly on sharing and automation as we go along. Okay, so I think many presenters use this kind of start to their presentations on this topic of new mobility. We're very much considering these 4 key trends, also raised by the first presenters this morning even, around electric, autonomous, connected and shared. And I think it's in Spanish I've understood this morning. I've learned something. It's mobilidad divisa. So that's the concept we're looking at here. And sometimes we can group together autonomous and connected, and we refer to these connected automated vehicles. But I really want to focus today on the shared part. These are some of the typical representations. They're not always like this. I think in Diego's presentation, he showed you some much more perhaps realistic visions of what urban mobility could be like. But if we look at some of these portrayals, we can see that there are underlying assumptions which are hard to believe. If we look at this futuristic car, bottom left, we can see that people are expected to travel facing backwards. We have to remember that the roads will not be changed. They will still have sharp 90-degree corners in the cities. In the rural areas and the interurban roads, there will be what we call potholes where the road has not been repaired. There will be circumstances in which people often feel car sick. Currently, if they read, simply automating the vehicles won't change that very much. There might be a slightly smoother ride, but it will not be a transformative experience. We will not be moving to railway train standards of comfort, I would suggest. So this is a first point where we're not being completely realistic. Secondly, when we look at typically these scenes, there is not much congestion. Where congestion is shown, it's normally in the context of connected mobility, showing how clever the systems are in managing large numbers of cars. But when we're considering autonomy and this general futuristic concept, there is lots of space available. There's little attention placed on how pedestrians will interact with this vehicle system. Interestingly, in this picture on the top right, we see the pedestrian also has blue connectivity rings. Are we suggesting you can only walk down the street if you have a mobile phone in your pocket or some kind of electronic tag? I don't think that's going to be an acceptable solution personally. We will need to massively improve the capability of the AI if it's going to interact effectively with humans, who can at any time step out in front of the vehicle and of course expect that it will stop. And congestion will not be completely solved as well by these new technology solutions. It's true there will be some reduction perhaps in congestion if we manage fleets more efficiently, but that depends on many other factors such as the level of demand for road space. Interestingly, the public transport vehicles are shown as less futuristic. You can just see in the distance here, in the top left, this yellow little bus. It looks rather like this vehicle, in fact. So not much change is expected over the current level of technological development for the public transport system in this particular kind of concept. So maybe we could see this as a more realistic presentation. The presentation of the cars is perhaps more appealing to that strong emotion that there is towards the private car. The public transport vision may be a more realistic one. So we are very much encouraged that sharing should be part of this new mobility, and it's a very positive concept in society. You know, as it says here, sharing is nice, life is sharing. But the big question is, will we actually share in an important and significant way? Often when we talk about sharing in the mobility system, it's not clear whether we're talking about sharing the vehicle in an asynchronous way, so one person uses it, then somebody else uses it, or we're talking about sharing collectively, sharing seats in the same vehicle. Just looking at the possible niches, and I would suggest also business opportunities and models just for the private car, these are the possible interpretations of shared mobility. Looking at the ownership of cars down the side here, and who they're shared with, and how many people they're shared with on the top. I don't propose to go through all of these now, but you know, traditional hitchhiking was an early form of car sharing. thinking of some of the advanced models now, we have peer-to-peer car hire, where one person owns a car but can rent it to their neighbours via an online platform. So there are many, many different ways of sharing, and this is just for cars. It doesn't include the sharing of public bicycles and other forms of mobility, such as the new e-scooters, which are coming to many cities. So these possible meanings must be carefully inspected to understand what implications they have for sustainable mobility. We cannot just accept that all sharing necessarily is going to be positive. So I think then there are a number of reasons why we should not focus the future of mobility around the current conception of the private car. That creates a number of problems for us, and I'm going to run through some of these briefly now. So the first one does come back to demand for road travel, as transport planners like to call it. To the normal citizen, this normally means congestion. We're moving to electric mobility. Yes, there are many barriers, but those are gradually being removed. Just today, the United Kingdom, the government has announced that we will end the sale of petrol, diesel cars from 2030. So we'll be second only to Norway in the ambition. Electric vehicles, of course, have the same road space requirements as any other kind of car, and they will not impact on congestion. Indeed, there are many reasons to believe that they could increase traffic demand. They're expensive to buy, but cheap to use. So the normal elasticities we apply to demand, if you reduce the price, demand is likely to grow. And currently, that's particularly strong because not only is the fuel cheap, but certainly in Europe, the very high fuel taxes that are placed on petrol and diesel cannot easily be transferred to electric cars. And nobody really wants to talk about a general road user charging system, road pricing. Few governments want to engage in that debate, but sooner or later, probably they have to address this problem of the falling tax revenues. Also, we talk about automation. And again, this is likely both to not have a great impact on congestion, certainly in cities, but it could encourage demand for car use. So there will be some benefits from platooning. The vehicles can be slightly closer to each other, particularly on the autopista, but there will be limits. They still have to be able to stop if the tire of one vehicle explodes suddenly. So there will have to be space between the vehicles that respects them, the physics as well as the capability of the technology. And they will need to be risk aversely programmed, particularly if they will avoid pedestrians and cyclists, and if people are to feel comfortable going around those sharp corners in cities. So I think the driving style of the automated system will emphasize comfort, and that means generally a calmer, slower progress, and there will not be a lot more space on roads. But if they really are so comfortable to use and you can sleep in them, read in them, of course, people may use them more. In fact, the UK government has done a number of analyses, and it predicts just through general economic growth, when we return perhaps to economic growth, then we will see by 2050 an increase in traffic on the roads between 17 and 51%, and congestion increasing 8 to 16%. There are a number of scenarios, but the scenario with the greatest traffic and the greatest congestion, that is the one where there is the greatest take-up of zero-emission vehicles, precisely because they're expensive to buy but cheap to use. So congestion is not going to disappear unless we do something very radical. It's just going to get worse. And I just wonder how relaxed this guy will be reading his book and his automated vehicle if he is on the way to a critical meeting and in a queue of automated traffic that cannot be cleared through the connected system fast enough. Just like when you're sitting on a train outside the station waiting for a platform, as another highly automated connected system, he's going to be pretty stressed, I think, not reading his book. The second reason is that we have an energy shortage. In fact, many people say we don't really have a transport problem anymore. In many ways, we have an energy problem. So again, this is the UK, but I think it's very similar for many highly industrialized states. When we look at the split of energy demand, transport is about between 2/5, something like that, of the total demand. Currently, that's provided from liquid fuels. So essentially, we are going to have to double the supply of electricity to meet demand, and convert all that electricity capacity to low carbon sources. So doubling the electricity supply and moving, currently in the UK, we have about 50% of our electricity coming from low carbon sources, including nuclear, wind as well. We're going to have to move to 100%, but also double the supply. It's a very, very major challenge. If we can somehow moderate the demand for transport, which is saw similarly to the slide from Mexico this morning, it's very similar in the UK. It's now the largest sector for carbon emissions contribution, and it's the only one that's still growing. And again, at the EU level, we can see a similar policy debate which has not been fully resolved. So the European policy foresees massive growth in demand, more than doubling of passenger and freight traffic. But at the same time, if you look at the bar for the energy per passenger transport, that's supposed to stay stable. I really question if this is going to be fully realistic. Another reason is that whilst electric vehicles are very good for emissions, they do not solve all the problems. This is, again, for the UK, but it would be representative of all states, really. We see how the particulate emissions from the exhaust systems of vehicles have been declining and expected to continue to decline over the next years. But we have these ongoing problems with the wear of the tyres, the wear of the braking systems, and road surface wear, all of which create particulate pollution. And this also needs to be considered as a great potential threat to human health. Bringing together a number of these points, if we have a large and increasing private car fleet, it makes it much harder. We are swimming against the tide, if you like, of trying to reduce carbon emissions and changing the transport system. So on the left here is a typical street in the UK. It could be London or just about anywhere. And think how hard it's going to be to provide charging capacity at people's homes in this street. Very expensive. There is no allocated parking, so who has the right to use which? There's also some semi-legal parking. Actually, if this is in London, this is now illegal because parking on the pavement is no longer permitted in this way. So some very great problems, already squeezing in the existing cars, but also putting in all the electric infrastructure, and enormously expensive. The suggestion is we do something as on the right here, where we have these local charging hubs. I'm not sure what this man is going to do for 20-30 minutes while he's waiting to charge his car. I guess sit on his phone, or maybe we could sell him something, so there could be some real business opportunities there. But it's going to be hard to provide this capacity. The UK has about 8,000 liquid fuel filling stations, which manage to cover 30 million vehicles. We're going to need many, many electric charging hubs to come anywhere near that level of equivalent supply. So if we can reduce the number of cars that we need to provide for, it makes the task easier. Consider the case of Norway. Now, Norway has now managed to achieve 42% of new car sales as electric, and a further 26% hybrid. But it's still, even with that massive improvement, if we consider the existing vehicle fleet, we still have many diesel and petrol or gasoline vehicles in that fleet. And there's going to be, even for that country which is most advanced in Europe, there is a very ambitious plan still to be achieved. So we should not underestimate the extent of the challenge. A fifth reason is, one of the topics that is little discussed is that this automation is going to be quite hard to introduce. We talk about the possibility to switch the driving between the machine, the computer, and the human. However, this comes to be a very dangerous practice, and indeed, it's not clear if insurance companies will really accept this transition between autonomous and manual driving. This is based on some research we did using this vehicle. It's a kind of Land Rover, adapted Land Rover. It's actually called a Bowler Wildcat. It's a test rig for automation. And we looked at how long it took people to recover control of the vehicle once they were given back control. Not an emergency situation, but it's what we call planned handover. Just to take control of the vehicle is 2-3 seconds, but to be driving in a normal state up to a minute. And some other studies done on simulator showed even longer times at higher speeds as well. So it's not going to be a particularly safe practice to have people changing between human and computer driving on a motorway, for example. You could travel hundreds of meters in this time. Lateralized stability is the extent to which you might veer into the lane next door. So just simply switching to automation is not going to be easy. But one possibility is that automation could be applied preferentially to public transport systems. And a sixth reason is about we risk to continue the ongoing problems of inequality in access and mobility. As we've said, electric vehicles are expensive to buy and they're cheap to use if you have one. But some people will be excluded as we move to electric motoring, perhaps from being able to buy their own cars. If we move to automated taxis, they will be a bit cheaper than human-driven taxis, maybe 40%. Not completely, it's not just simply removing the cost of the driver. You will need to add the cost of the surveillance system. There will be additional costs associated with maintaining the automation technology. So we can't just say that the saving is equivalent to removing the human driver, but nonetheless, they will be somewhat cheaper, perhaps 40% cheaper. They're still going to be a lot more expensive than buses. So if the automated Ubers replace buses, then there will be some people who suffer a loss in their mobility. So I just want to turn now to consider how we can really make the collective public shared high occupancy vehicles more attractive. Another project I'm working with is called Multicav, and this is the automated electric bus that we will be evaluating. This is a classic 50-seat bus with some room for standing. It's essentially replacing the existing vehicle. This is one possible way we could develop. Ultimately, we need to be aiming for some kind of ideal future mobility mix. This example here, I think, is hard to beat. And I think it applies equally now, but notably this has been around since 1995. The problems don't really change, and in terms of the discourse, the words, the problems haven't really changed, and the solutions maybe not so much either. So we need fewer vehicles on the road network, higher average vehicle loading. The third point here sounds very much like mobility as a service or on-demand transport. So these modernistic concepts fit very well. Essentially, we want simplified access to information and ticketing and flexible services. More energy efficiency, fewer in-street emissions, and a fair division of space between motor vehicles and other road users. So there's nothing new. But this is why it matters so much about the sharing of vehicles. And I think Bruce raised some of these points as well. So there have been various scenario modeling exercises. If we consider the transition of our current vehicle fleets in cities to a completely synchronously shared cab fleet, so these are automated connected vehicles that you share with people you don't know, we would actually massively reduce the number of vehicles we need. They will be very intensively used, but it could be as few as 10%. That's probably a low case estimate due to the effect of peaking. But conversely, if we allowed people to use these vehicles exclusively, then we would still need 80% of the current vehicle fleet, because there will be little sharing in practice if people are able to select exclusive use. If we consider the impacts on traffic and congestion of such changes, then we'll see that congestion could actually double or just increase slightly, even with the very high level of sharing. So the worst case scenario, we double congestion and traffic if we use the exclusive version of taxis. That's because the vehicles generate traffic and repositioning, because people will not be optimally available in their locations, so there will need to be some repositioning traffic. It also allows for the fact that vehicles could be attractive, so they could be used more. So we could see a doubling in both measures if we don't do this correctly. And similarly, other studies have shown that without effective sharing of vehicles, we will see an increase in greenhouse gas emissions and energy use. So does automating vehicles make sharing more likely? Some people have argued, they suggest that just because they're automated, it's going to be so easy to use them, people will be happy to share. I think there are some real problems with this idea. So we each have a particular emotional relationship with the car, and there's no reason why that would just disappear because we automate it. Perhaps, maybe it will affect. We don't know enough about this yet, but we can't assume that automation reduces attachment to the car. Will people be prepared to share with strangers? Under which circumstances? And if we automate the vehicles, are they prepared to share the vehicles without any kind of driver or onboard staff? The staff, the driver, represents an authority figure, a kind of umpire who maintains the social space as well as the physical space, ensures that people are not threatened, is a contact with the emergency services, for example. Yes, you can replace that to some extent with closed circuit television and communication systems, but we don't know yet how far people will accept that. And then there could be some ethical questions. Are we going to allow people to choose who they share with? In some studies we've done, that's people's condition. Yes, I will share the vehicle as long as I can choose who I share with. That could be a very socially negative outcome, creating ethical concerns with people able to express some negative choices around others in society. So we have tried to undertake some experiments into people's willingness to use and pay for these shared vehicles, comparing cars with exclusively used taxi, that's DV taxi, driverless taxi, a shared driverless taxi, and a driverless bus. So I won't run through all these now, but these basically represent the various conditions that we gave people in an online experiment. So the bus was a kind of minibus vehicle. The shared taxi and the two taxi options were quite similar, but obviously you had to pay more for the exclusive vehicle, but you had to wait slightly less for it because you wouldn't be waiting so long because it would be coming directly for you and it wouldn't deviate off the route at all, the exclusive taxi, whereas the shared taxi might deviate slightly to drop somebody off or pick somebody up. So what we found through a cluster analysis, and if you're interested, I'm happy to share the paper with you. What we saw was that around half the sample, this was a few years ago now, that figure might go up if we repeated this study, around half the sample was willing to use an exclusive taxi. And they would be willing to pay around £1 a mile. That's not far different from €1 a kilometre. That's about half or a third of the current cost of a taxi. So that's quite interesting. Then we see for the minibus option, slightly more people actually, around the same number willing to use that, and they're willing to spend around €0.50 per kilometre, something of that order. And that is also more or less in line with current bus fares. Lastly, we see a big drop in interest in the shared taxi, down to only 40%, although those people that were willing to use it were actually prepared to pay more than they would for the bus. So there are two things happening here. People are more willing to share a larger vehicle with more people on it. There's a greater sense of being in a public space. A very small vehicle doesn't generate that in the same way. But also, there are certain groups of people, and I think this is very critical for understanding business niches, service niches, that people who answered our questions around their sociability were much more willing to pay to use the shared automated vehicle than others. So you can see some demand segmentation emerging. However, this was an online experiment, and we wanted to do some experiments in the real world to improve our understanding. So we had this opportunity in another project called Capri, working with this real automated vehicle. Personally, I think it's a little more attractive design than the one I showed earlier on, slightly more futuristic, maybe more appealing. It's a 4-seat vehicle with a face-to-face configuration, which again is not ideal, perhaps for comfort. We also have looked at this comfort problem, and people don't like traveling backwards as much as they like traveling forwards, that's for sure. It also affects their trust. So we undertook a similar experiment, but this time, rather than it being completely online hypothetical, people undertook a stated preference experiment. They then had a ride in this vehicle for a few minutes, and then we asked them to undertake the stated preference task again. It was similar, but not identical. They were choosing between their current mode, typically the car for most people, self-driving taxi, shared self-driving taxi, and a self-driving minibus. We asked them to, the experiment contained a number of categories, including who they will be sharing with, how many people, the waiting time, the travel time, which will be influenced by the kind of mode of transport it was, and the travel cost, which is obviously lowest for the bus, and then most for the self-driving taxi, and intermediate for the shared taxi. Smaller sample because it's quite difficult to run these experiments. You need several days just to give a few people a short experience. And this is what we found. So there are many results, but I'm just sharing this one today. Again, I'm very happy to share any papers if anybody would be interested. So before the experiment, in blue, the most popular mode in terms of this virtual journey, so we asked them to think about a journey, and they rated it in this stated preference experiment. Car came out as the highest preference, although the automated taxis weren't far behind, and the bus was the least preferred mode. After the experiment, we did see an improvement in the automated shared taxi mode and the automated taxi mode exclusively used, and the car went down very slightly. It fell quite a bit for the bus. So what this shows was exposure to the actual vehicle did improve people's rating of it, but people shared the vehicle in the experiment, and more of them afterwards said that they would prefer an exclusively used vehicle. So I think there's some positive and negative here. It reminds us that people are diverse in their views again, and what one person prefers, another person won't. But it does suggest that there will be a strong pull towards an automated, exclusively used taxi. So that's potentially a concern for policy. So just thinking to the future then, this is my personal vision as to how we might bring some of these things together. This is a notional idea of a city region. You can see the bigger city over on the left here, a small town, small settlement on the right. I could see the case for mainline automated transport, a bit like our vehicle in multicav. It will be easy to provide very high priority for a vehicle on this fixed line route. They could be fast, efficient, frequent, high capacity. rather like the current bus, but taking advantage of automation features. Then we use the small shuttles to feed in, and these, as Bruce was discussing, could be on a demand responsive basis, or they could be a fixed basis. They don't all need to be identical. There could be different market niches here with people offering different kinds of service, maybe some exclusive, maybe some shared. And of course, there could be some private cars in this as well, and there will be some parking facilities available at the green interchange hubs. And within the town, you will perhaps have one of these systems circulating just to help the urban movements there, bringing people to the main hub in that town. So that's a potential future integrated, sustainable, autonomous, electric, shared transport system. And that's the vision I would like to leave. Just finally, to summarize, the fundamental problems of transport are very similar with or without these new mobility technologies. However, the technologies, they create new opportunities to solve these fundamental problems, and they can enhance the user experience. The easy thing to do is for the automotive sector just to produce more technically capable, comfortable, luxurious cars along the existing model. The harder thing to do is to really take these new technologies, develop collective mobility concepts that respond to preferences that people have. And some people are concerned about their privacy, they don't particularly want to share. So what can we do to improve the conditions for these people, to make it attractive to them while still using road space and energy efficiently? So I found one concept from Malaysia to share with you. They call this the yuppie van because I think they see it for young professionals commuting. And here you can see it's like a minivan with 6 different little compartments, each with their own door, and the idea that you could travel like on the shuttles to Google premises in the United States, already starting your work on the commute in. So I'm not saying I particularly think this is a great idea, but it's just one example. And this is the kind of thinking we need. How can we reconfigure the space of vehicles to make shared mobility more attractive for people who have been used all their lives, perhaps, to enjoying their own private car space? So here's some links to our various projects, and feel free to contact me. And thank you very much for your attention.
MoBAE, trabajando por el futuro de la movilidad avanzada y extendida.